Discussions on the nature of UFOs remain extremely polarized between those who support the extraterrestrial theory and those who oppose it. This polarization is putting up a wall in debates and preventing the examination of further possibilities. In 1997, at the invitation of American billionaire Lawrence Rockefeller, well-known scientists gathered in Pocantico, New Jersey, to discuss UFOs. It was the first time since 1969, when the Air Force dropped its investigation into the matter, that a panel of scientists had gotten together to discuss UFOs. Led by astrophysicist Peter Sturrock, these discussions brought the strange sightings to the academic forefront. Mark Roediger and John Schussler were among the scientists invited to the meeting.
The purpose of the meeting, it was designed by Peter Sturrock to do at least two things. One was to be a rebuttal, as it were, of the Condon Report. The Condon Report, of course, had come out in the late 1960s, and it had said that UFOs were not worth studying scientifically. And Sturrock had been very critical of that, and he had always hoped that he could get a group of scientists together to look at the phenomena objectively and reach a different conclusion, which he thought would be justified. So that was the first thing. The second was to present some of the latest UFO evidence to a panel of distinguished scientists to get their advice on the subject, to see how they would react to UFO evidence that the scientific community normally doesn't ever view.
The meeting was held in 1997 to allow the examination of physical evidence presented by people that do research in the UFO field to be examined by people outside the UFO field. And in both cases, these people were scientists receiving the information, presenting it, and then the scientists examining it. And they were selected based on people that could present the actual physical evidence, not stories, not wishful thinking, but evidence of things happening, real photographs, real videos, real medical effects, real ground trace effects, and that sort of thing. And in this field, there's quite a bit of that. It isn't often talked about and often discussed, and Dr. Sturrock thought it would be well to be able to expose this to an independent panel of people that had no interest or no knowledge of the subject, and get their opinion on what could be done or what should be done and how important it was. So that was the reason we met.
There wasn't anything amazing in the reports from the panel. I think the evidence was solid. Of course, I was there and presented some of it. I think it was evidence that the phenomenon is anomalous, but there wasn't anything so compelling that, you know, you would read the report and say, oh, why, this is astounding evidence. Why, you know, this really shows that this UFO phenomena is unearthly or alien or can't be explained by science absolutely. You know, no, it was just good, solid UFO evidence.
The scientists gathered at Pocantico concluded that the UFO problem was not simple and was certainly not the result of a general or single phenomenon. The report added that each unexplained observation presented the scientific community with an opportunity to make new discoveries through the study of these phenomena. However, out in the field, the main difficulty in studying UFOs is learning how to pinpoint what's relevant. Over the years, UFO circles have become such a melting pot for all phenomena that it takes a lot of serious research to find any significant proof within UFO reports. Between 1991 and 1994, Nick Pope was tasked by the British government to assess the pile of UFO sightings recorded by their Ministry of Defense. He therefore had ample opportunity to appraise the quality of the statements made by witnesses.
I think it's quite clear that 90 or 95% of UFO sightings are either misidentifications of something quite ordinary, but perhaps seen in unusual viewing conditions, or by a witness who is not familiar with the particular object or phenomenon. But there are these hardcore of cases, and there has been, right from the beginning of our official investigations in this. And this is as true for the Americans with Project Blue Book as it is for the British. There are these sightings that we can't explain. Good quality sightings. I'm not talking about cases where we have insufficient data. I'm talking about the sorts of cases where we have, say, police or military witnesses or pilots, say, who are seeing solid, structured craft. I'm talking about the cases where things are tracked on radar. I'm talking about cases where Air Force jets have been scrambled to try and intercept these things, and where perhaps we have good photographic or video evidence that has been properly analysed and enhanced. These sorts of cases. And when looking at these cases, I am quite favourably disposed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because when I've eliminated everything else, that seems to be a very real possibility. Can I prove it? No, I can't. We do not have proof. But in my mind, we do have good evidence.
UFO sightings are an undeniable fact, proven by the thousands of statements and recordings that have been submitted. These sightings happen. Explaining them is another thing. Making a broad statement that they're all false or they're all true based on a single explanation seems rather simplistic to me. The truth of the matter remains to be seen. It's true that most cases are false alarms. In our work, we have proven that most cases are the result of an honest error made by the observer, while now and then we see cases where the error was made intentionally or designed as a hoax.
In actual fact, what happens most of the time is that a person comes face to face with something that they do not understand. And they contact the police in the hopes of getting an answer to the mystery. Of all the sightings that are reported, practically none of them turns out to be a hoax. I would say maybe one hoax per 1,000 cases reported.
But for all of the other cases reported, there is no reason why there needs to be one single explanation. The proof is the fact that we're discovering new things every day, like sprites in the upper atmosphere, which we discovered a few years ago. They might explain some of the strange lights seen by aircraft in the sky. So there's certainly a whole gamut of explanation. The extraterrestrial theory is simply a projection based on a desire to believe, and for good reason. If we take a look at aviation files and radar data, which seem to show objects displaying intelligent behavior, we're very tempted to believe just that. In actual fact, it's only one possible explanation.
Unfortunately, ufologists usually have nothing more to go on than statements made by witnesses. How valuable are these statements really? Rationalists tend to discard them under the pretext that a statement alone has no inherent value. We must exercise caution in considering these statements, but they are still a valuable source of information. If statements people make are truly of no value, then we might as well shut down the court system. Critics like to point out that when it comes to witnessing a UFO phenomenon, most people are not used to observing phenomena in the sky, even police officers and pilots.
Arguments are always being raised against UFO stories, usually by rationalists, because there's a difference between scientists who work as researchers and rationalists who adamantly oppose any stories of UFOs. Their argument is that astronomers don't see UFOs. If all these things were flying around in the sky, then scientists, especially astronomers, would see them. The problem is that astronomers spot UFOs the same way as everyone else. We know that for a fact. Peter Sturrock, an astrophysicist from Stanford University, did a study back in 1977 which showed just that. Another study showed that 5% of UFO observers were astronomers, so they do see things too. But what does an astronomer actually do? He doesn't look at the whole sky, just like scientists don't look at nature. They look at their instruments. A telescope has a very small field of vision. If an astronomer were to see a UFO, it would only appear in passing like a satellite, a meteorite, or a bird. It would be very rare. They wouldn't have time to focus on the object. It would be gone before they knew it. When they see a meteorite fly by, they don't make anything of it. So astronomers do see strange things in the sky, but not usually while they're working. There's a genuine problem. When UFOs are discussed, some people say that they don't exist. The problem is not whether UFOs exist or not. The problem is that tons of arguments seem to be based on the idea that scientists observe nature, so they should be seeing UFOs. Scientists do not observe nature, they produce facts under laboratory conditions, very specific artificial conditions that do not correspond to the image of science portrayed in popular science magazines.
Most UFO sightings have a perfectly rational explanation. They should not be considered of alien origin until all of the elements involved have been thoroughly analyzed. This analysis stage contains many hidden traps. Although they represent a very small percentage of objects reported, weather balloons can be mistaken for UFOs. Even seasoned observers, like civil and military pilots, have been fooled by these large silver spheres. Don Ledger, a Canadian civil pilot and co-author of Dark Object, took a keen interest in UFO sightings reported by his colleagues. He is familiar with the most common misinterpretations, like weather balloons, Venus, aircraft, auroras, meteorites, and billow clouds.
Normally, getting off track a bit here, usually large scientific balloons, and they are large. Some of these things are 300 feet across. They're filled with helium, and they're carrying scientific packages. We'll get a NOTAM as a pilot. You'll get a NOTAM with your about every 3 months in the mail from Transport Canada, and it's NOTAM that this thing is going to be lifting off from a certain area, usually up north, where the air is more stable and where they're investigating anyway. And these things will go up 80, 90,000 feet. And as they go up, you've probably seen the older pictures of them. They look long and skinny, almost like a baseball bat, and then they start looking like an ice cream or a parachute. But by the time they get to altitude, they balloon right out because the air pressure is less up there. So they turn into this big, oval, shiny thing because of the makeup of the material, you know, the Kevlar or not Kevlar, but the mylar that makes these things up. And can carry up to 4 million cubic feet of helium in there. Right? And they can drift around up in the upper atmospheres for days and days and days, reflecting sunlight. And people will report them, and that's really, they have every right to, because it's quite anomalous looking up there, and it's sparkling away. So they account for some UFO reports and so on.
There aren't that many weather balloons. They're launched in northern Quebec. Winds are predominantly from the west, so don't try to tell me that these supposed weather balloons are traveling from north to south. Okay, now that I've made that perfectly clear, let's drop this whole weather balloon business. Skeptics better come up with a better explanation than that, because according to them, weather balloons are everywhere. All UFOs are weather balloons. Observers have more chance of seeing an aircraft since planes are aluminum and maybe painted white, so when the sun is low on the horizon, it can reflect off the cabin. The wings can't be seen, just a fine white line in the sky, so since the object is far away and can't be heard, it can be mistaken for a UFO. Venus is also a possibility. Most people in Quebec travel between Montreal and Quebec City. So they travel east-west on highways 10, 20, and 40, which means they may spot Venus setting in the west. If you see Venus setting in the north, call me, because it isn't Venus. Of all the planets, Venus is the one that is most often mistaken for a UFO. So what I'm saying is that people may be mistaking aircraft and planets for UFOs. That's true, but it's time they stop trying to tell us that people are seeing weather balloons.
In the spring of 2002, a Montreal businessman filmed a curious sight in the sky. It was very early in the morning, and the object showed up clearly against the morning sky. Upon analysis, it was discovered that the object was nothing more than a mail plane arriving at the local airport. At times, the source of confusion is much more simple. Officer Nelson Jean with the Quebec Provincial Police recalls a UFO sighting recorded at his station.
At the time, we were responsible for covering Montérégie, Montreal, Laval, the Laurentians, and Lanaudière. As I recall, it happened near Saint-Julie. People called to report colored lights in the sky. When our police officers arrived at the scene, they traced the lights back to a dance club. Someone was either accidentally or intentionally projecting laser beams into the sky. which was leading people in the area to think that they were seeing something from outer space, perhaps a UFO or a signal from extraterrestrials.
Other than laser beam projectors, aircraft, and weather balloons, we also need to consider objects entering Earth's atmosphere. Orbital debris, which is becoming more and more common. A few years ago, during a similar incident over France, the state police were inundated with calls throughout the country from citizens wishing to report a UFO sighting. At the time, Jean-Jacques Velasco was already heading up the French group CIPRA, which tracks objects entering Earth's atmosphere. It is an agency working for the French National Space Research Center, otherwise known as CNES.
We've noticed that these days, a lot of sightings result from debris falling from objects in orbit. This was the case on November 5th, 1990, when we witnessed an amazing display of debris from a Russian rocket. The debris was scattered throughout the skies over Europe, particularly over France.
Films and photographs can be useful tools to ufologists as they try to make heads or tails out of a UFO sighting. But once again, a visual aid in itself does not constitute proof that UFOs are alien in origin. This is true even more so now that new computer technologies allow amateurs to fake photos that look as professional as anything produced in Hollywood.
Well, as you know, I'm quite familiar with the field of photography, since I worked as an expert in this area when I was with CNES. I came to the conclusion that it is one of the most disappointing aspects of UFO cases. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, it's the element that evokes the most emotional response and most expectations from the public. We often hear people say, if only we had a good picture of this, we could check into it further. In actual fact, nothing is further from being solid proof than a single photo on its own. That was true even 15 or 20 years ago. Back then, I received funding to study all the tricks involved in photo analysis. We noticed that some people were very clever at faking photos. Nowadays, with computer technology, anyone can use commercial software to touch up photos. I've had a bet for 10 years that no one can produce a photo able to withstand photo analysis tests. There are two types of photographs of so-called UFOs. There are the cases where the witnesses are in a state of panic over something that they saw, and there is little information available. These pictures are typically a small white light against a dark background, or if taken during the day, the object appears as a small dot in the sky, as was the case in Vorep, France a few years ago, when an object was photographed against a clear blue sky. Even using the most powerful tools possible, the information extracted is minimal. Then there are the photos for which more information is provided. At the other extreme, you have fake photos. They don't pop up as often as you might think, but they still seem to be profitable in some countries. When I traveled in certain southern countries, I noticed that books were being sold with fake photos in them. Generally, they're pretty easy to spot. Then there's the majority of cases where an honest error is made. This happens when a person sees something that appears strange to them, and they take a picture of it only to discover later that it was simply the aurora borealis or some other uneventful occurrence. There are also cases where something odd happens in the camera when a picture is taken. Cases of optical phenomena or cases where something is on the film. I once saw a photo that had me stumped for the longest time until I analyzed the film under a microscope. As far as misinterpretations go with respect to photos or home movies, a lot of people mistake reflections for UFOs. Many people use small camcorders these days, which is great for us UFO researchers, since these films provide us with good visual material to analyze. I'll give you a quick trick for figuring out whether or not your photo or film has a reflection on it. You just need to draw an X across your photo. Take a ruler and draw a light line with a pencil from one corner up to the opposite corner. Then do the same with the other two corners. This will give you the center of your picture. If the brightest object in your photo is a reflection, then it will cross the center and keep on going an equal distance in the opposite direction. The reflection can't be anywhere else. The angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence. This is a basic law of physics. People often take pictures through a window or a glass pane, and cameras also have a protective lens covering, which can create reflections when a picture is being taken, like of a street light or of distant car lights. The photographer doesn't see the sources in his reduced field of vision. A car passes by, shines on the lens, and a small lens-shaped reflection appears on the photo. Before you call the press to say that you've just photographed a flying saucer, you should double-check to make sure that there are no reflections in your picture. Only then should you consider that perhaps there really was an object in the sky. If there was an object, then it's time for what I refer to as the investigative process, noting the color of the object and calculating distances and so forth to determine the size and possibly the weight of the object.
At times, the so-called UFO is nothing more than an unidentified optical object. In the early 1990s, there were several sightings of discs with scalloped edges, vaguely reminiscent of the symbol used by the comic book hero Batman. According to the reports, these bat-shaped discs first began to appear over Belgium, before spreading to Spain and then the United States. Unfortunately for mystery lovers, there was nothing exciting behind these UFOs. The image was nothing more than a bright object, such as the moon or a streetlight, filmed out of focus due to the focus ring on camcorders that had just come out on the market at the time. Speaking of images, Earth is now constantly monitored by a network of satellites. Each day, these spies in the sky take dozens of pictures of the Earth. Why aren't there any satellite images of UFOs?
Another mistake that ufologists often make with respect to satellite images is that they think if UFOs are flying around the Earth, we should see one appear on the satellite image now and then. When they say that, they obviously do not realize that remote sensing satellites circle Earth every 90 minutes at an altitude of 500 to 600 miles. If we look at satellite images, all we see is a bunch of tiny dots on a huge surface. Even if an army of 100 huge UFOs landed on Earth within the space of a few hours, it is highly unlikely that they would be detected by any of the dozens of satellites hovering over Earth.